Hi everybody, and welcome back to our slow crawl through the first chapter of Luke and the beginnings of chapter 2 that we're doing here at St. Mark Presbyterian Church. I'm Mark Davis, the pastor here, and we are going to be studying this Gospel of Luke bit by bit between now and December. And this is the second part of the series, so if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. You might want to circle back and watch last week's video. And if you're joining us for the second time, welcome back. So after today's video, we're going to have a live and hybrid Zoom discussion here at St. Mark and on Zoom on Wednesday morning at 9:30 Pacific time. If you're available to join us, we'll be meeting in the Bonhoeffer room here on the St. Mark campus. If you can join us by Zoom, I will send out a Zoom link with the email with which I sent out this video. If you have any questions, how to link to the Zoom and so forth, again, Mark at stmarkpresbyterian.org, and I'll be able to respond to that. I've had a little trouble last week kind of negotiating the hybrid meeting. I had a computer over here just to make sure things were working correctly, and I had trouble responding easily to some of the chat questions that came in on the Zoom. Just remember, I'm looking at an iPhone, and behind that, actual people in the room. And so I don't think I responded well either to people in the room or people on the Zoom last week. So this week, in our Zoom discussion, we will have someone sitting at a computer on the Zoom chat and able to respond to the chat that's there and to represent the questions in the room, which would be a whole lot easier for us in our discussion to handle well. So I hope that works better. We're going to keep tweaking our process week after week to try to make it as helpful as possible. Now, today we have two questions that we're going to be addressing. And the first question is a question that I would consider a question that we get from in front of the text. And what I mean by that is that in these three verses we're going to read, Luke introduces Zechariah and Elizabeth. So when we ask the question, who are Zechariah and Elizabeth, we're asking the question that the text invites literally for us, right? This is what the text is talking about. But there's another question that will arise just because of the way this text shapes us. And in our reader response to the text, we're going to ask a question that I would consider a question that takes us behind the text. We might be wondering, to whom is Luke writing? Now, we saw last week Luke is writing to Theophilus. That might be a real person with a great name. It might be a representative name since it means friend of God or lover of God. Even if it's written to an individual, as one of our participants pointed out last week, those writings often are intended to be publicly read. So it's not just Theophilus, but it's the house surrounding Theophilus, the church, and so forth. So to whom is Luke writing? Who is Theophilus? Who are the intended audiences? Those are questions we want to ask that take us behind the text. And in order to answer them, we're skating on thinner ice when we do that. But in order to answer them, we have to look for snippets of information and kind of put together our theories. So enough of that. Let's read these three verses together. In the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah, who belonged to the priestly order of Abijah. His wife was a descendant of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. Both of them were righteous before God, living blamelessly according to all the commandments and regulations of the Lord. But they had no children, because Elizabeth was barren, and both were getting on in years. This ends the reading, and it is chock full of things for us to talk about. So let's take verse 5 and break it into three pieces, because it's about three different people. In the days of King Herod of Judea. You see that, how in the days of King Herod, that this is what I would call an imperial marker. Luke is making reference to the Roman Empire here. King Herod was king of Judea, not by the vote of the people of Judea, and not necessarily by the wars fought within Judea or whatever contention there might have been there, but by the blessing and the appointment of Rome. So this is how the Roman Empire was present in Judea at this time. So see, Luke is beginning with a very clear imperial marker. And that's not terribly common in the Gospels. There will be references to the empire, many of which are implicit, some of which are explicit. Luke uses it as a time marker. We're going to see it again in the Christmas story, right? And there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. And this was the first decree that went out while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Quirinius. Who can even say that name? Who knows who that is? Who cares who is the governor of Syria at this time? When you start asking questions like that, now you're starting to say, well, who was Luke writing to if they knew or cared about who was the governor of Syria at this particular time in history? You see what I mean? These are imperial markers that in the easiest way, you could just say was a way of noting time and assuming that people know that, you know, the whole 4 BC and 33 AD, those dates aren't in use yet, right? So the way you mark time is you talk about who is in charge. And people who have any rudimentary understanding of history, or at least knowing who's in charge, that helps. Luke is often accused of being a little too friendly with the Roman Empire and doesn't quite have that agitative kind of resistance to the empire that we see in the Gospel of Mark, for example. That's a judgment call, but it is true that Luke will use imperial markers. And so let's look at this one for a moment. King Herod, to whom he's referring to, is the one known in history by the nickname Herod the Great. That's what he was called in his time. That's how he was remembered. It's a little confusing because there are actually 2 Herods in the New Testament, in the Gospels, right? You've got this one, who is the king as John the Baptizer and Jesus are born. And then, when Jesus is a grown man, we presume some 30 to 33 years later, there's another Herod. That's not this Herod. That's his son, Herod Antipas. We'll deal with him when we get to him. And he's not literally a king. He's a tetrarch, because this kingdom was broken up after Herod the Great died. So don't get the 2 Herods confused. This is not the one before whom Jesus will be in trial and sends him to Pilate and back and all of that stuff. That's not this Herod. This is his father, Herod the Great, he's called. He was a very savvy politician. He was a strong military leader. He was vicious. He was horrible. But he was also pretty savvy, and he ended up being the king of Judea for over 30 years, like 37 years. So this was a big deal. And he was king of Judea not because he, defeated all the other potential kings of Judea. He was appointed by Rome. So Mark Antony, you know that name, Octavian, you'll know that name in a minute, because he was later called Caesar Augustus, and another Marcus Lepidus. Those 3 together were a triumvirate that led Rome after the death of Julius Caesar. Okay, so you had a 3-person, kind of 3-headed leadership there. Mark Antony is the one who suggested that King Herod be appointed king of Judea. It was approved by Octavian, which is very important. So he's king of Jerusalem, king of Judea, not divinely appointed like David was years ago, but appointed by the empire. Okay, that's very important. The other thing to know is that he stayed king for a long time, including after the Battle of Actium. The Battle of Actium. It's worth knowing that battle, because while there was that triumvirate of Mark Antony and Octavian and Marcus Lepidus, there was a rivalry that brewed between Mark Antony and his lover Cleopatra and Octavian. And that ultimately led them to fight one another for control of the Roman Empire. And the Battle of Actium was a significant battle when Octavian's forces pretty decisively beat Mark Antony's forces. It would be another year before Mark Antony and Cleopatra were utterly defeated, and they both ended up committing suicide as a result. But that Battle of Actium was off the Greek coast was a significant battle. And during that time, Herod the Great was actually on Mark Antony's side. But then, after Octavian defeated Mark Antony, he switched loyalties. So when I say he was a savvy politician, he was able to switch loyalties without being killed in the process, and enough to convince Octavian that he should remain as king of Judea for a long time. He became a rather favored person in the eyes of Octavian, who, as I said, after defeating Mark Antony, became Caesar Augustus, with the honorable one who was solely over the empire. So this Herod, he mixed into all of the imperial intrigue and politics going on at that time. At the same time, he said he was Jewish. I don't know if he walked down the street saying that, but his father had been a king in Idumea, which is the Old Testament empire of Edom. And at one point, when the Jews had a brief period of self-rule, the Jewish leader conquered Idumea and forced all of them to become Jewish, all the men to become circumcised. And so Herod, because his father is from that region, his mother was I think a Samaritan, he had some right to call himself Jewish. So you have this Jewish figure and imperial figure together in Herod the Great. It takes a savvy politician to hold that together. And so I want you to imagine for a moment what it's like living in Judea under the reign of Herod the Great. Now, when this birth story takes place, it's right toward the end of Herod's life. And so he's not going to be around in the story very long. But as I mentioned, he was very vicious. He chose one priestly line over the other, and the priestly line that he opposed, he ended up having most of them killed. The Hasmonean priestly line in Israel. And among them was his wife and 2 sons that she had born to him. This was a political decision. Apparently he actually was fairly affectionate with this person. But in the process of defeating that rival religious power, he had them put to death. His wife and children, along with many of the priests there. So on the one hand, he's vicious, he's cruel, he lusts for power above everything else. On the other hand, he took the temple that Solomon had built that had been desecrated and so forth over the years and rebuilt it, doubled in size. It became one of the kind of architectural wonders of the world at that time. And he's the one who built that. So it's called the Second Temple in a lot of biblical studies. He printed temple coinage that would not have a human likeness on it, because that's an icon. You're not allowed to do that according to the law. He appointed priests to be part of the building committee that built the temple. So in some ways, he was really currying favor with the Jews by rebuilding the temple, expanding the temple, and instituting a temple system. On the other hand, he was vicious. So the question is then, to whom is Luke writing? Is he writing to people in the empire who will know when Herod the Great had been appointed? That's an imperial time marker that makes sense to them. Or is he writing to someone else? Let's just lift that question up for now and not explore it any more than that. All right. So, in the days of King Herod, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly order of Abijah. Okay, so here we have the introduction of Zechariah. He'll be all throughout this chapter and never again. He's not mentioned anywhere else. There's a Zechariah who's mentioned elsewhere. There's a Zechariah who's a priest who was killed in the Old Testament who's mentioned elsewhere. But this Zechariah is mentioned here in this first chapter and then never again. Okay? But he's identified here as a priest. And so I want you to take a minute and let that sink in. He's a priest, and he's going to be described well. I want that to sink in because there's kind of an incipient anti-Jewish flavor that we often get mixed in with our lessons and sermons from the Gospels. It is true that Jesus is often in the temple or the synagogue criticizing the temple system. It is true that the chief priests, along with the scribes and Pharisees, are typically those who are dogging Jesus and actually the ones provoking the whole trial that leads to his crucifixion. So it is true that there's real legitimate tension there between the message that Jesus is bringing and the system that the priests are bringing or protecting, or the message that they hold. But don't forget this. There's a priest. There's a priest. And his name is Zechariah. And he's spoken of well. Okay? So the system itself is not rejected. While there may be some practitioners within the system that are rejected, the system itself is not rejected. We start with a priest named Zechariah, who belonged to the priestly order of Abijah. So let's go back to that imperial marker that Luke had, saying when Herod the Great was king of Judea. People throughout the empire would know who that is. Who knows who Abijah is? You don't. Tell me where Abijah is in the Old Testament. Come on. I don't know either. I mean, I had to look it up. It's in 1 Chronicle, chapter 24. It's an occasion when David is dying. Solomon is getting ready to be the next in line, kind of an imperial succession. We're seeing that happen in Great Britain right now. And so there are tons of questions. What things will continue? What things will not? And one thing that David does at that time is he institutes a temple system that will cohere after the death of the individuals. And that's why it's passed down from generation to generation. One of those orders is Abijah. It's like number 8 in the process. There are tons of names in there, none of which we know. They're just appointed, and their sons and their sons and their sons after them are supposed to maintain this temple system. And in verse 10, it mentions Abijah. Honestly, go read 1 Chronicles chapter 24 and see how forgettable that name Abijah is. And the only reason I raise that, I mean, it's a legit thing, right? Zechariah would know he came from the lineage of Abijah. That's why he's a priest. So it's a legit thing. But it goes back to the question, to whom is Luke writing? The people who care that Herod was king of Judea may not be the people who have any clue who Abijah is. So while this, to to someone like Zechariah, this gives some sachet to his bona fide credentials, right? To the general public, who would care about this? So to whom is Luke writing? Just that group of people who would know who Abijah is and who would read that and go, wow. Or is he just addressing someone else at this point? It's hard to figure out to whom Luke is writing, and I'll circle back to that again in a moment. So, the days of King Herod, the priest named Zechariah of the order of Abijah, and his wife was a descendant of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. All right, so Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptizer, we're going to find out later that she's a kinswoman to Mary. She's all over this first chapter, and a remarkable person. And after this chapter, we never hear about her again. Never. Okay? So, it's important to Luke, not to Mark, not to Matthew, not to John, not to Paul, but very important to Luke. Her name was Elizabeth, and she also has some lineage worth listening to. She's from Aaron. So if you think back of your Old Testament studies, you had Moses, right? Moses is the one who led the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt, and to whom God gave the laws. Moses had a sister named Miriam and a brother named Aaron. The three of them together were kind of leadership there throughout the wilderness journey and so forth. And Aaron held the priestly duties. Moses was the leader, the one who communicated with God. Aaron was like the first high priest, more or less. So, Aaron is also the one who, when Moses was on the mountain receiving the 10 Commandments from God, and the people began to get restless and wonder if he was ever going to come back, Aaron was the one who took all their gold jewelry and fashioned the golden calf and said, here's your God, worship this. So Aaron's an ambiguous figure in some respects. There are a lot more redemptive parts of the story about Aaron. But you remember, Moses wanted him as a spokesperson because Moses had a stutter and felt like he would not be able to lead the people well, and asked for Aaron to be his spokesperson. It's kind of an interesting thing. So Aaron becomes the spokesperson and the priest. And so again, if Luke's going to mention that Elizabeth is from the line of Aaron, to whom is he writing? Who's going to hear that and either know what it means or be impressed by it? That's a really important question. And so already in verse 5, we're starting to see that in front of the text we have Aaron, we have Herod, Zechariah, and Elizabeth. And then behind the text, we've got this question like, by mentioning this imperial construct and these rather obscure lineage of Abijah and this more well-known lineage of Aaron, to whom is Luke writing? That's the question behind the text that gets raised. But we got 2 more verses. Here we go. We describe Zechariah and Elizabeth, these products of the priestly lines. Both of them were righteous before God, living blamelessly according to all the commandments and all the regulations of the Lord. So, they're called righteous. That's the word that we've talked about in worship here at St. Mark. We had May Elise Cannon here from the Churches for Middle East Peace that did a whole sermon on this word. And the Greek term there is dikaios. Dikaios, you might remember, named after Dike, the god of justice. Could be translated justice or righteousness. But this word translated regulations here, that's got the same stem. This is dikaioma. So you can see, I put the Greek there not to impress you, but so you can see just how similar those 2 words are. And so I'm a little surprised that the translation we use went with regulations rather than righteousness. I think it's because it's plural and it's paired up with laws or commandments, and I think they're just trying to find an equivalent way to say the same thing. But I think righteousness is far more than regulations. So I'm a little skeptical of that translation or the strength of it. But I want you to see the relationship between those two words. This is high praise. They are righteous and they are blameless. The word blameless is the last word in that sentence, which gives it some priority. They are walking in the ways of God just like they're supposed to be. Remember that when you hear the word priest. Here's a priest and his spouse, another priestly line production. They are walking before God blameless. This is very, very high praise. Verse 7. But they had no children, because Elizabeth was barren, and both were getting on in years. The Greek word that starts this verse is kai. It's a very, very common term. If you ever do any New Testament translation, this is probably the most frequently used word in the Gospels. It means and. Think about how often you might use and. It almost always is translated and, or also, or even, and it shows continuity. Why it is that our translation and most modern translations have decided to interpret it as but is curious to me. It's not impossible. I mean, it can mean but. However, there are two other words that are more frequently used to imply contrast. Typically, kai implies continuity. So, they are blameless, walking, in righteousness before the Lord, and they have no child. Is Luke saying, oh, here's another thing about them? Or is he saying, but they have no child? As if this is somehow contrary to what it means to be blameless and walking before the Lord in righteousness. I don't know. It's an interpretive judgment on our biblical translator's part to turn that kai into a but, as opposed, and imply contrast as opposed to continuity. And they have no child because Elizabeth is barren. Now, was Luke in any position to know this? Were his sources in any position to know this? Maybe it was Zechariah who was shooting blanks. We don't know, right? But we will say that it's a very traditional biblical approach to not having a child, is that it's the woman's fault. And so on the one hand, this is a judgment, a medical judgment that really probably lies beyond Luke and all of his sources' abilities to make. But it's also very familiar. It reflects some of the patriarchy of Scripture. But I want to argue that it's more than that. It's a theological point. Okay? And let me show you what I mean by that by looking at the last phrase. And both of them were getting on in years. Literally, both of them were walking into their days. Where have we seen an aging couple where she was barren, and yet they're going to end up having a child contrary to expectations? Well, we know that very well from the story of Abraham and Sarah in the Old Testament. And we know that there, Sarah was barren. Abraham was able to produce a child through Sarah's handmaid. And so the burden of childlessness and the embarrassment of it fell onto Sarah. I would argue that the reason we're told both that they were blameless and righteous and that they were childless and Elizabeth was barren and they're getting on in years is because the question, who are Zechariah and Elizabeth? On the one hand, they're descendants from these priestly lines. On the other hand, they're Sarah and Abraham, the parents of a child of promise. So this is that story being picked up and retold all over again. It's really a fascinating thing. In Genesis 15, when God tells Abraham they're going to have a child, it says, Abraham believed, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. That same word that we saw describing Zechariah and Elizabeth. So you see, I think in some respects, they're being represented to people who know the Old Testament as a moderner day version of Abraham and Sarah, who had a child against all expectations in their dotage. In fact, they named him Isaac, which means laughter. And we'll talk about that on Wednesday, and why he would be named that. So the question is, to whom is this story directed? And I want to throw something by you on Wednesday. There's a theory that the story was written originally by John the Baptist's disciples, and that then Jesus took it, and then Luke took it and wove it into a gospel written for Jesus' disciples. And that's where we'll start on Wednesday. I don't really have time to walk through that today. All right, so again, if you have any questions, you can either write info@stmarkpresbyterian.org or mark@stmarkpresbyterian.org, and I'll see you on Wednesday. Thanks. Bye.